start again. Yeah, welcome. So welcome everybody. So welcome to this Not Equal seminar series, and this is the last in the series. And this is running in conjunction with our summer school on social justice and the digital economy. So some of the people, who've been, I think, are talking today, and also, but certainly quite a lot of participants have been involved in that. And we're really pleased, though, that everybody else who is here has joined us. So, just showing that I can't do my technology. Yeah, so I'm Alan Dix, and I'm working with the team. Here you can see so Clara, who is our I don't know, muse and leader who has taken us through this journey. Anne Light, Lizzie, Colescamp, and myself, who make up the team I forgot to say where we're all from, but it says there, Clara from Open Lab, Anne Light from Sussex, Lizzie from Royal Holloway, and myself from Swansea. Not Equal is one of the projects, one of the Network Plus projects funded by E+C. So this is worth about 1.2 million in total, and has been about trying to explore the relationship between social justice and the digital economy. The principal way we've done this, done a range of things, but the principal way we've been doing this is by funding a number of events, collaborations, small projects, more than 16 in total, which often get academics to work alongside non-academics, particularly stakeholder organisations, small community groups and different kinds of organisations, and also running smaller events and larger events that try to link people together to create the sense of a community of people who are excited, concerned, and desiring to do something about social justice in this world where digital technology is one of the great drivers. So Anne and Clara have been organising the summer school that's been running this week, and I think will have its last day tomorrow. And as part of organising that summer school, these evening seminars have been made as an open webinar series. So we hope that can reach out, and obviously those of you who are here listening, it's reaching out to you, and the recording will go into the cloud forever, or at least for some time, as long as digital technology and clouds last, and I hope reach out to many more people as well. So yeah, I mean, I was looking at my notes here and saying the pandemic has been, both a challenge to us, and certainly within the project. A lot of the small projects, and also Not Equal as a network as a whole, has had to reorganize itself. However, I'm not sure which was a good side, but certainly one of the benefits that we need to take forward is also allowing us to be far more international, open, and in many ways access is greater to the sort of events we're doing. So we want to make the best of that, but whilst not forgetting some of the deep problems that have been there and are still happening around the world. So this is the last event. There's been 4 of these webinars. This is the last of the webinars in this series, and we've got 3 speakers. Crumbs. I'm not sure what I meant. Well, I'll introduce as each come on, but Carl De Silva, Sarah Naomi Lee, and Al Robertson. And I think that is, and they're all going to talk in different ways. And I have told them they have to be really, really exciting, because I had a bad night last night. I woke up at 3 a.m. So it's been a long day. So they have to work like Billy O to keep me going. But I think they will. It sounds like a really exciting program. So first of all, I'm going to pass you, and I'm going to keep my notes because otherwise I'll mix them all up and say things about each one, which is not true. But yeah, we're going to start off with Carl De Silva. So he's associate professor in the digital media program in the School of Literature, Media and Communication at Georgia Tech, Georgia Institute of Technology, or Georgia Tech as we normally think. He directs the Public Design Workshop, which is a design research studio that explores socially engaged design and civic media. He's also co-director of the Digital Interdisciplinary Liberal Arts Centre. Boy, that's a mouthful. So I hope you've practiced. You can say it quicker than I can. And it's a Digital Civics Initiative founded by the Mellencamp Foundation. And he also leads another initiative called Serve, Learn, Sustain Fellows Programme. And that's about bringing faculty, staff, students and community partners together to explore social research themes. And it says I'll let you tell about the themes because I've got the 2016-17 themes. You've probably got more up-to-date ones than that. Anyway, so that's enough. I will pass over to you, Al, and I'm really looking forward to that and hoping. No, it's not Al. I've done them wrong way around. It's Carl's.
That's okay.
Oh dear, yeah. Anyway, I'm going to pass over to Carl. I think it's because Al's face was appearing, Carl's wasn't in my screen. So I'm going to pass over to Carl, and I hope I said the name right everywhere else.
Yeah, that's fine. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen.
That's the thing. Get me out of the way. Yes.
Okay, so hopefully this is working. Yes, great. So thank you for the invitation to speak today. I'm actually going to talk about. I give a talk I haven't given before, which is always a bit terrifying, that builds upon some current work that really has to do with thinking about the ideas of experimentation and imagination and how they come together for us in design work. And I'm going to go through this fairly quickly. And as I was mentioning to my colleagues before the room opened up, I've left plenty of holes in the talk, which should provide plenty of opportunities for questions afterwards. So the way I'm going to break this down is through four small segments: why experiments, democracy as experiments, what experiments do, and what does this mean for practice and theory. And I'm going to do that again swiftly so that we might have time to chat about these things. So I think, we begin with this question about why experiments? Why is this word and this idea interesting to me? Why would it be of interest to others? And the reason being is because I think that we are struggling to understand, to talk about and give shape to what we are doing. And the we here, at least for myself, is primarily designers, but others who are engaged in other sorts of critical and creative practice with a social bent to it. And the challenge is to say, we're doing a new kind of work, right? Or a different kind of work. And how we think about that and how we do it is unresolved, right? And at least I myself find myself grasping for ways to explain and to make sense of what it is that I'm up to. So I was looking around for examples because you might say, what is he talking about? What kind of work is this, right? And I actually realized I didn't have to go far at all for examples, right? Looking at this program, the programs that you all are involved in, I would argue, are precisely these sorts of examples, right? This work is not design as we commonly know it. It certainly appears in many ways to be similar to design. And yet, if we were to take the standard sorts of discourses that we use to talk about design, we would find ways in which those discourses fell short of actually explaining what's happening here, helping us to make sense of it, helping us to take it forward. So several years ago, close friends of mine published a paper that I have been obsessed with, right? And in it, they proposed this idea of what they call democratic design experiments. And this paper I have always found really moving, in large part because it comes from a tradition that I see myself as participating in, which is that tradition of participatory design. And it begins to articulate a different way of doing practice that is around this idea of an experiment. Now, to be clear, designers are not the only ones who are engaged in this. In fact, at the same time that this comes out, we see another series of publications that are coming out from different fields, right? We see the work of someone like Norcha Maras coming from sociology and anthropology, who's also advancing this idea of the experiment. We see a number then of interdisciplinary works that are blending together design and the social sciences, all of which, if we were to crack open these books, and perhaps you have, you would find the word experiment liberally throughout it. What's important to me to think about with this is not that these experiments are necessarily different, but that we're looking at them in different ways, right? So the way that I'm going to look at this thing called an experiment as a designer is going to be different than how, for example, Maras might look at it as a social scientist. Not that those differences are value judgments, right? But that they represent what is important to us, right? So the kinds of questions I want to ask about an experiment as a designer are going to be different than the kinds of questions that a social scientist might want to ask. And my perspective to this is very much coming at it from that of a designer. So I keep coming back to this paper time and again. And one of the reasons why has to do with a very particular word, and that's this word here, right? It's the idea that these are not just design experiments, but they're democratic design experiments. And in my own work, this is the word that's important, right? And I know that at times this word, democracy or democratic, may almost seem quaint, right? Given particular situations that we're in now. But it is actually a word that I hold on to dearly and find to be incredibly important and moving and something that's worth sticking with. And what's important then is not just how do we do these design experiments, but how they are themselves democratic and the ways in which they might contribute to democracy. Which of course then brings up the question, what are we talking about, or what am I talking about, right? When we talk about democracy. So there's numerous ways that we often talk about democracy. And one is when we think of democracy as a structure or a mechanism. So we might think about various kinds of structures of representational government, right? And the ways in which that enables something that we call democracy. And within that, we might think about various kinds of mechanisms, such as voting, as one way in which democracy happens. I want to be very clear. I think that this is like the structure and mechanisms of democracy are important. And I used to quip if voting changed anything, they would make it illegal. And then I moved to the South, right, where in fact there is concerted and ongoing efforts to do exactly that, right, to disenfranchise large numbers of people from participating in the structures and mechanisms of voting, to make it not possible to say I voted. And it's worth noting that it's not just anyone, right, but there are very particular peoples that are tried to keep out of these structures and mechanisms. All of which is to say that this is important, right, but it's actually not my focus, right? So my interest in democracy is when we think about democracy as a kind of communal living, a kind of togetherness. And one model for this is, to me, programs like the People's Kitchen Collective, which comes out of Oakland, California, which is actually comes out of a tradition from the Black Panthers of providing food and eating together as a way to literally nourish democratic forms of togetherness. And I think we've seen a lot of this notion of democracy over the past year in response to the crisis of the pandemic coming out in practices of mutual aid. So from my interest, what we're talking about when we talk about democracy, what I'm talking about is communal living. The challenge, however, is we don't really know how to do this. And it's not something that we're ever going to really figure out because this is a lived, situated experience, right? Those conditions, those will always be changing, right? And so the question about democracy as communal living is also a question about democracy as experiment. A lot of my work draws from the traditions of American pragmatism, and in particular, the work of John Dewey, who founded this idea of experimentalism, and for whom democracy itself was a practice of experiment. So for Dewey, democracy wasn't, again, these structures and mechanisms. Democracy described a way in which we lived together. And how we pursued that was through what he termed experimental means. Now, it's actually fair to say, at the end of the day, Dewey has really gotten his due. And aren't there others that we might look towards? And of particular importance to me over the past couple of years has actually been the work of Jane Addams and the Hull House. And what's important to me about Jane Addams that's different from Dewey is that for Addams, we actually see a lived theory of the democracy as experiment, different from just a conceptual or intellectual activity. So for those of you who don't know, the Hull House was established in Chicago in the late 1800s, and it provided services to the poor, many of whom were immigrants to that city. And those services ranged from housing to education to job training to forming unions to actually doing research together with both academics and government. And the Hull House was formed by Jane Addams. And this is a picture of Addams. And I show this to you not so much to focus on the children, but to point out that for Addams, the project of the Hull House, the project of democracy as experiment, was a project that was her entire life's work. Right? She did not start the Hull House as an old woman, right? But it was something that she continued throughout her life. And what happened at the Hull House was a kind of series of experiments in how the democratic condition might be differently configured. And you see a set of images here that I think are really important, right? If we look closely, what we see here is we see people learning together. And those people are crossing generations. They're crossing genders, which in the late 1800s and early 1900s was rare. They're crossing ethnicities. So the picture in the top right was particularly striking to me. My family emigrated from Sicily in the early 1900s, and a lot of the pictures of my relatives look like the young men in that photograph in that top right corner. And importantly, they're actually all engaging in this idea of democracy as an experiment through making. Making is central to this practice of democracy as experiment in the work of Jane Addams and Hull House. And so what we really see through this is that democracy, in this case as an experiment, it happens. Right? It's not just a thought exercise. It's an event that actually unfolds in time and space, and it occurs. So this leads us to the question, well, what is it that these experiments do, right? Your word is being used, kind of thrown around. And one of the arguments I want to make is that design experiments are a particular kind of experiment. So generally, what experiments do is they produce facts which change our mind about something, and that change in understanding ends up actually begetting more and sometimes different experiments. We can think about this from the kinds of experiments we might have done in chemistry class as young people. We know something different about the world after the experiment, and so we ask different questions. So for Isabel Stengers and Miriam Fraser, right? Fraser interprets the work of Stengers, who talks a lot about the experiment, as a kind of inventive problem making. That what the experiment does in science is it provides the opportunity to ask more questions, to continue to engage in experiments. It's not that the scientific experiment resolves itself, right? Rather, it asks the question, which then enables us to ask the next question. Scientific experiments enable us to know the world differently, but my argument is that what design experiments enable us to do is to imagine the world differently. Just as the scientific experiment brings about facts, the design experiment brings about conjectures, right? So design experiments are not scientific, right? They do not produce facts. Design experiments enable us to conjecture. Here's a quick example. In 2012, right? The eastern seaboard of the United States was hit by Hurricane Sandy, which was unprecedented. And in response to that, folks who had been involved in the Occupy movement created a mutual aid response program called Occupy Sandy, which provided relief to people who were suffering from the damage done by the hurricane. That relief included all sorts of food, medicine, all sorts of social services. As part of this effort, a group of designers actually said, how can we support this? What might we make to further this imagination instantiated of a kind of society based around mutual aid? And they went out and they made a series of signage systems that were posted around New York City that actually provided ways for people to get to these resource depots. This is one of my favorite examples of a kind of experiment that happens in the small. It touches on this idea that Binder, Brandt, and Hulse talk about in their paper, that democratic design experiments work by making these issues experimentally available such that the possible becomes tangible, right? We're able to actually grasp onto what might be possible. What's important is to recognize is that the possible isn't a fact, right? In the case of Hurricane Sandy relief, right? Mutual aid-based societies is not a fact. It is first and foremost a figment of the imagination that we make temporarily manifest, right? And when we indulge in that, we can imagine further still, right? We imagine the world differently after an experiment. And as designers, what that asks us to do is to make different things to continue to cultivate those imaginaries. This is the work of the design experiment. This is the importance of imagination in the context of that. When we think about that Occupy Sandy example, we imagine the world as if it was a world of mutual aid. And then as designers, we ask, what might we make to cultivate that imaginary further still? So what does this actually mean then when we begin thinking about doing this in practice and theory? How do we go from this general idea to saying, what do we wake up and do tomorrow differently? I'm only going to touch on two things briefly, and then we can hopefully chat much more about it. The first is, I think more than anything else, what we need to be doing as designers is really nurturing our skills and making imagination manifest. Does that mean that we need to learn or draw, or does that mean that we need to learn to draw or code? Certainly it might mean that, but it might also mean that we need to take up other kinds of activities as well. We might need to take up the kinds of activities that have been referred to as infrastructuring or institutioning. We might need to learn how to take on activities such as organizing and mobilizing, right? What we need to do is we need to figure out, how do we nurture our skills in making imagination manifest in ways that allow us to collectively experience those possibilities for communal living. This requires the invention of new practices, right? This in itself is an experiment. I also want to put in there as a little aside that one of the ways to get at this imagination is to think about working with those already existing alternate presents, because what they are engaging in is often more radically imaginative than what we would speculate on our own. The world envisioned by folks, for example, who are pursuing mutual aid is in fact a radical imagination of a different kind of world. And the question for designers is not to invent those worlds for themselves, but to see how they might fit in together with these already existing alternate presents. But to do this requires the invention of new practices. We also need to learn how to describe and judge design by how it cultivates our imagination. This is the important thing to do from the perspective of theory and scholarship. The question that we should be asking about design when we ask, does this design work, is is not a question about rote functionalism or instrumentalism. It's really the question, how does this enable us to experience possibilities for communal living? Right? And as part of this, we have to develop new vocabularies and themes that are otherwise from the domineering norms of design, discourse, and evaluation. So to be really specific, right, we have these sorts of models that are so common in our design education today, even when we find people talking about things like social innovation or social enterprise. But I want to make the argument that these sorts of models are not actually workable. These sorts of models are not going to get us to new sorts of practices such as mutual aid. What we need to do is to be inventive, to be creative around these new practices, around these new vocabularies that describe and judge what it is that we are doing. And from that, we'll be able to develop a practice of design experiments that allow us to actually participate and contribute to making other worlds possible. So I've talked about this in regards to the idea of democracy, but I want to say that it doesn't have to be limited to democracy, right? We might need to nurture our skills in making imagination manifest. Yes, for communal living. For others, it might be for questioning, how do we live in the midst of climate change? For others, it might be questioning, how do we live in moments of capitalism, right? This question about what it is oriented to is a question that we can answer differently based upon our own commitments. Mine happen to be to democracy, and so my questions happen to be oriented towards this idea of communal living. But the experiment is not limited to democracy. It can be oriented towards any kind of world making that we want to contribute to. And this, I would argue, leads to a new kind of practice where really experimentation and imagination are bundled together and shape differently how we might do design otherwise. So with the hope of providing time for conversation, I'm going to end at 20 minutes, which should provide plenty of time to talk about these ideas a bit. Thanks.
Oh, yeah. Wonderful. Thank you, Carl. And so, yes, I can see there's some questions appearing already. Yes. And what I'm going to do is actually I'm going to pose the first one I can see, but I'm going to prefix this with something because I think the two might go together. Because one of the questions that's been going through my own head from the beginning is that, you know, when one thinks of experiments, it's who does the experiment and you know, who does it get done to? You know, who decides the experiment? And I think this might link to this because there's a question here from Rachel Sanders. You know, so these issues about agency, and I know as a participatory design person, you'll have views on this. So I'll let in. But there's particular questions I think might link to that too, which was saying, how would you look to make design and design experiments intersectional? So again, I think it's about the audience and the people. Yeah.
Sure. That's a great question to start with. I want to answer that in two ways, specific to myself and more broadly, right? So I think one of the ways that I do that is, as much as possible, I actually try to pursue this work with people who I am different from, right? And actually what's interesting is Jane Addams has this wonderful passage in the end of one of her books where she says that it's actually a moral imperative that's placed upon us to go out into the world and to work with those who are other than us, right? That it is not that amplifying, you know, she never obviously uses the term intersectionality, but that's an important part of what it means to actually be doing democratic inquiry. And so for myself, I think that becomes a crucial part of this work, is seeking out to work with communities, if we can use that word, that oftentimes I'm not otherwise a part of. And I think that that also requires a very different way of working, and we could talk about that more. Second, I do think that we have institutional responsibilities in order to make design much more intersectional. And I think that there's ways in which we have to begin thinking about who are we counting as designers? How do we expand the conversation of what is considered to be design work? My colleague Daniela Rosner has done fantastic work on this and thinking about what are the stories and histories that we tell of design, and what are the stories and histories that we have not told about design. And if we broaden that, can we begin to broaden what we think of as design? And is that one way to approach the question of intersectionality? So I'm going to offer that as my initial answer if I want to go on to the next set of questions.
Yeah. So what I'm going to do is actually, I'm going to skip to what's the most recent question because it picks up, I think, connects into this, and then I'll go back to some of the early ones. Because there's another the question here from Ruth Beresford saying about disenfranchised groups. How do you deal with disenfranchised groups who feel like they've got limited hope? And it's that hope that allows imaginative thought about better futures. I know from the very, I was going to say, the very possibly dodgy scientific experiments about creativity, but one of the pervading issues that comes again and again is that positive emotion leads to more creativity. And this, there'll be, as with everything, it's very cultured. So, and it is often the case, certainly, I'm going to say this from personal experience, that when you're in a disadvantaged situation, it is very hard to have that imagination. So I just want, yeah. So how do you deal with that?
I guess what I would say is I think that oftentimes these groups that are disenfranchised, in fact, still do have very vibrant imaginations. I think that they may not align to the same sorts of imaginations that were common, I think, to other discussions where we have to think about about actually change. And so this is a great question. We've wrestled with this and thinking about, how do you begin to talk about so I'm very leery of the word empowerment, right? But how do we think about empowerment as not something that resolves itself, where suddenly some group has dominion, right? And where they didn't have that before, but rather very sorts of different relational type discussions. And here we're really influenced, if you look at a writer like Octavia Butler, I think that she really influences us in her discussions. For example, her sort of Afrofuturist writing. It's not that somehow the world suddenly ends up to be perfect. And I think this also ends up becoming a question for us with theory, where, yeah, we actually need to admit that design is going to have to embrace new affects, right? And this gets us to an interesting discussion with folks like Sarah Ahmed, where it's not that we're going to achieve mastery over our environment, right? It's not that somehow we're going to wake up tomorrow and capitalism will be undone, right? Or that structural racism will have ended, right? It's rather that we're going to learn how to thrive in these environments that are, in fact, threatening and caustic, right? And that requires, I think, a very different affective orientation to what it is we do as designers. And to understanding that what hope or imagination looks like for communities is going to be different. We've talked about this in terms of relation to care. And one of the things that we've said is, one practice of care is hospice. And there's times when we work with our community partners where a community knows that community is going to die, right? That neighborhood's going to be gentrified. And the question that they're asking is not, how do we make that not happen? But how does that happen where we retain a sense of dignity? And that's a very different approach to thinking about this. So I would agree, this is exactly what I mean. This is why we have to rethink what we expect the outcomes to be, because it's not going to be this mastery over the environment that has typified much of design.
So I'm going to jump back now to another question that you framed this experimentation, you framed, first of all, the scientific experimentation in terms of this sort of learning process and the different kinds of learning. So there's a question here about how you connecting this into pedagogic theory and as a learning thing, and thinking particularly about constructionism and social constructionism and the way in which in an educational setting, that's often about making things external, making them concrete, taking the mental imagination and making it extant. So yeah, so basically, what do you think about the relationships between those, and have seeing this as a pedagogical as well as a democratizing experience?
I am, and I'm also going to give a personal answer to that. So I think the key to this is learning. I think that learning is an important part of this. I think that there's, in some ways, what we are doing is we are learning how to live together differently, and that. So yeah, I think that learning is central to this endeavor, and we could ask, how do we engage in that process of learning? To what extent is all of this a kind of legitimate peripheral participation in some new form of life together, right? I also stopped short of going too far into learning theory. My partner is a learning theorist, and one of the ways that we make our relationship work, since we both do PD, is like drawing a line between who does what. So I have immense respect for thinking about this exactly within that tradition, but I'm certainly not an expert in it. And I think it'd be great for someone to think much more about this in relationship to learning.
Okay, and I can do one last question.
I can tackle two of these really quickly if you want.
Okay, great. Oh, you're seeing it as well. Yeah,
I'm seeing it too. So I'm going to tackle them in reverse order, I think. Yeah. I think the experiment is related to the prototype, but quite different. I think that the discussions of prototypes within design tend to be that the prototype is seen as something that exists along a continuum in which there's some sort of a finality, right? We engage in the prototype actually to reach something that is somehow seen as being more final than the prototype. I think the experiment doesn't do that. The experiment doesn't assume that there's something more final than that. It is not the same progression of design that is common to the use of the word prototype. So that would be my quick answer to Laura's question. I think to Christopher's question, yeah, without a doubt. So one of the things that gets brought up, I think, is that this idea of experimentalism recognizes that there is a notion of conflict and contestation, right? So democracy needs to constantly be renewed through experimentation, and part of that is the questioning and as sort of agonistic engagement with what we consider to be the status quo. And so I think that, what's interesting is that there's often people assume that pragmatism is conflict averse, but I actually would argue that it is not that. I think that pragmatism recognizes that conflict is an inherent part of democracy, and in that way, it can actually shake hands with theories of agonism.
So I'm going to call that to end. I'm going to leave you actually with a question to think about, because I think this might recur to things at the end, which is one of the things that I also worry about, because in experimental approaches in the social domain, is what happens when the experiment ends. So, but I think there's going to be, there's an interesting question, I think, which might recur for some of these others, these what afters. So I'll leave that to settle into your imagination when we move on to Sarah, and I'll get and so thank you. So thank you very much. This is where you want the yes. We'll assume you've got your claps, because this is one of the things that's more hard to do for Zoom, isn't it? And we're going to move on to Sarah. And so Sarah Naomi Lee, developing creative and highly innovative arts and media projects since 2002. Professional touring theatre. It comes on. I was just trying to look a thing. When do the sheep appear? Anyway, professional touring theatre, creating stories collected from customers in a black hairdresser in Brighton, and a 3-year funded project on digital media storytelling, which brought together schools from Ghana and the UK. So sort of wonderful background there. And as well as being a professional theatre and radio drama writer, she runs her own arts and media community interest company. called Plenty Productions, and the co-founder of the Brighton and Hove Black History, which recently completed a successful heritage lottery-funded project about Thomas Highflyer, who I'd never heard of, a boy freed from enslavement who lived and went to school in Brighton in the 1870s. And is also going to talk about sheep, which is, we found a common point in sheep. And so and by the way, I'm going to say, one is, Carl, you kept me awake. That's really good. Sheep, you've got to be careful, because this is how you send people to sleep, isn't it? So, but I'm assuming you won't. So I'll hand over to you now, Sarah.
Great, thank you, Alan. Thanks for that lovely introduction. Yes, sheep don't actually come up in that biography. Sheep are a sideline. I'm really thrilled to be here, and thanks to Anne for inviting me to come along to this event. I feel a little bit like an interloper because I'm not familiar or cognizant with the world of participatory design. I'm on the sidelines of academia in various guises across the arts, digital media, neuroscience. So I would call myself a polymath who has a foot in both camps. And I'm constantly fascinated by the rub between creativity and academic practice, and how we can do a little bit of what I loved Carl's talk, talking about using experimentation. And I think actually my slightly wacky, I have to say this is a slightly wacky talk, a little bit like Carl. I haven't done this before, but I think it's a little bit wackier than Carl's. But I really wanted to, when Anne invited me to take part in this event, I was thrilled, first of all, but also I wondered if there was a way in which I could engage my abiding fascination with sheep with my academic vigor and interest in all sorts of subjects around how knowledge is created, how we make sense of the world, and how the sorts of issues that have been debated this week in the seminar could be refracted and reflected through taking something really incongruous and unlikely like sheep and applying that in some way to some of the themes that we've been talking about. So my brief was basically to listen into some of the workshops that have been happening this week and think about how to respond to them. When we were asked to do it, myself and Al, we're both writers, so I was quite tempted by the writing, but because Al's doing the writing, and I also love illustration, and I love drawing sheep. I love drawing cartoon sheep in all sorts of different guises, and I find it's a way of reframing, a little bit like what Carl's saying, it kind of reframes how you feel about what feels quite a particular worldview can be moved around, and also that word remade. I love the idea of things being remade. If you remake something, you turn it into a new perspective. So when Anne Light said to me, make a creative contribution to our summer school, I thought, oh, well, I could do some drawing. I could do a sort of illustration of a visual scribe of the event, which I've seen people do, and that's very nice, but it tends to be quite descriptive. So I thought, well, what would happen if I tried to describe what I heard through the refracted, limited lens of sheep and their facial expressions? And I'm going to share my screen now, just to start off with, to show you. What I've done is, I'm going to start off by sort of giving you a bit of background to my sheep obsession. Firstly, I'm a shepherd for Brighton Hove City Council, which I've been doing for about 10 years. And I have to make a confession that when I see sheep, I get this kind of warm glow inside. It's completely bonkers. I've got no idea why. There is something about them that speaks to me on some primal level that I can't even articulate. So I constantly draw them and study them to try and work out what it is about them that I find so utterly beguiling, fascinating, and infuriating. So one of my projects, which is actually currently a BBC radio play in development, is actually called The Multifarious Expressions of Sheep. So when Anne asked me about this, what I need to say is the fascination with sheep is something about trying to work out what it is they're thinking and what it is they're feeling, and why it is that when I look at them, I get a sense of blank attentiveness, which in itself is a paradox. So what I've done during my time as a shepherd for Brighton Hove City Council is I go along to all the different places. They're all around the city, and I go and draw them. I sit there and draw them. I look at them, and I try and make a sense of what it is that they, what it is, this engagement. What is this thing that is engaging me and enthralling me about these really quite strange ovine creatures. And one of the things I've been doing within that is creating a typology of what I called multifarious expressions of sheep, which actually appear in the radio play. I'm quite obsessed with the number 7, so I've got to 7 different expressions. So I've got, as you can see here, dull-eyed despair, mindless chomping and grazing, excuse the expletive, pissing yourself in terror, staring blankly, moody mastication, vacant sitting, and barely concealed panic. And when I've gone and looked at the sheep, this seems to cover the gamut of expressions that I've been able to see with them. And somehow that gives me great ontological security. And I have no idea why, but I realize it's something about me trying to create a landscape or create a sense of how to engage with these particular animals. And I also draw them. So this is some of the drawings that I've done with them. So on the left there, we have expression number 1, which is dull-eyed despair, which you do see quite a lot on sheep that are quite knackered looking, that are quite old and have been around a bit too long. Mindless chomping and grazing is also one that I've seen quite a lot. So what I do is I'm basically playing with this typology and trying to work out what to do with it. So when Anne said, come to our seminar, I thought, right, I'm going to listen to what people say and I'm going to apply and think about sheep in relation to what I hear. So unfortunately, due to some family issues, I was only able to attend one of the seminars, which was the Monday one, which was called The Evolution of Social Justice in an Era of Machine Learning, which was fascinating. So I'm just going to show you some of the things that came out of this. There was Irina Shlavoski, sorry if I'm pronouncing her name wrong. She did a fascinating presentation about how AI and machine learning was situated and relational and not systemic. And I realized that one of the things that I found really interesting within that is that my own system was actually the same. It was also relational and situated, because one of the reasons the sheep was pissing itself in terror was because I was looking at it. So if I wasn't there, it wouldn't actually be doing that. It would probably be doing something else instead. So in fact, I was co-creating this expression that was then reflected back at me as my reality. And so within that, I began to realize that some of the things that Irina was talking about around the innate biases within AI machine learning and the perceptions that underpin them, which are about it being an overarching, quite reified system, actually really were part of what I was trying to reproduce in this slightly crazy typology. So that's one of the, that came from one of them. This was one that came from a gentleman called Michael Muller, which was, he used leotard, and I have to say I love leotard, so any excuse to use leotard always makes me happy, and referred to the meta-narrative of scientific determinism. And this was my attempt to, one of the things he said, which I loved, which is just at the bottom right-hand side, was how people tend to excuse bias by saying the data made me do it. So with this conveyor belt, this leotard conveyor belt, I felt like I was trying to capture a sense of the overarching eminence of a machine system that was actually excluding those that deviated from the norm, which within that presentation was about the androcentric nature of those assumptions. Within this, again, however, I realized what I was doing was bringing my own constructivism within my assessment of what was happening. So, for example, number 5, which is multifarious expressions of sheep, number 5, which is dead-eyed despair, is actually my projection on how I perceive people behaving when I see them stocking up toilet rolls in Sainsbury's during a pandemic. I'm actually imbuing these creatures with a set of statistics, with a set of assumptions, which are actually very value laden and related to my own discomfort and frustrations within what I see within the conventions and the constraints of the society that we live in. And so within that, I'm also aware that I'm bringing those assumptions into what felt like a more playful, and freeing metaphor, which actually in a way was bringing me down. This was from Laura McGregor, who did a great presentation from a law perspective on designing AIs and regulation. And I just thought this idea of this is a sheep that's being repurposed, but we don't actually know who for and to what purpose. And to me, this really, but within all of them, what I've realized is that all of them are the subaltern. They're all victims. They are all people who have no voice. And so within this process, what I'm doing is creating these creatures that are having stuff done to them, which in a sense was actually one of the things the panelists were really cleverly deconstructing within their presentation. So I found the whole process quite fascinating. I'm aware that I don't have that much time, so I'm going to just draw out some points here before we have a brief chance for a chat. So my conclusions really were doing this was, firstly, I was actually surprised it was actually quite I thought, how on earth can sheep tell us about social justice in the digital economy? Well, they did, but they also said more about my values and assumptions underpinning that set of questions about what I felt sheep represented to me, what they said about how I defined society and saw it as a mass of populace that had stuff done to them in a way in which they were quite voiceless. But within that, what I love about drawing, which I do all the time with all sorts of conceptual issues, is it allows me to move things around in a non-linear way and show power differentials that I cannot do within a linear narrative of an academic article. And I think that's incredibly powerful. And I think this really feeds back to what Carl was saying around experimentation and creativity. And it's almost like this idea of mixing things up. I also believe that if you have what I've called here a restricted palette, in this case, it was just sheep and their expressions. What that does is less is more. It gives us more space for experiment because we're closed down. And some of the best writing that I've done for radio and theatre has been where there has been a restriction applied. And I wonder if there's something we can think about with that in relation to participation design and some of the wider issues that we're discussing here. And then just finally, it revealed my own assumptions. So when I'm looking at the sheep and it's pissing in terror, it's pissing in terror because I'm looking at it. And I think that is something that I think is really important for us to acknowledge, that in our definitions and understandings of what people are doing and who we think they are, we are co-creating that as much as we are seeing. We're seeing what we think is there rather than necessarily what is a given typology that exists as an immanent system. So that's why I said, who are you looking at? So that's me. That's some of my favourite sheep. That's some of the I think they're Sussex Down. Alan, you would know that because they're quite fluffy, aren't they? I think there's some Sussex Downs sheep that I had the joy to encounter on the Downs. So I just wanted to say thank you very much for listening to my slightly crazy, but it was great fun and very stimulating, and it taught me a lot about my practice and also a lot about how we might be able to apply some of those questions. So thank you for listening, and I'll stop sharing now.
Yeah, sheep. Yeah, I mean, as you were talking, I was realising, looking at the Sussex Downs and thinking about some of the more primitive breeds of sheep and all the loadedness that goes with that statement as well. But the way in which, sheep are not sheep, by their very existence, have been co-designed by, or designed, depending the structure. Even their physical shape, the amount of wool and that, it's very strong patternings there.
Yeah,
exactly. So this first question got in the chat, and I am. Oh, I've lost it there. Oh yeah, crumbs. Where's it gone? Oh, there we are. Oh yeah, more of a beard. So the first question, I'm going to ask a little rider after it, but I'll let you go first. Is, do you think illustration could be used to break down cross-cultural boundaries in communicating ideas, especially complex cross-cultural issues?
Yes, I would say in answer to Rachel, definitely. I think that the freeing of space is very important. I think that sometimes dense text can actually make it very difficult for people to necessarily penetrate what's important, and those sorts of cross-cultural complex issues. When I was doing the project in Ghana, we were doing a cross-cultural digital exchange using children in the UK and children in Ghana, and we were very much using artistry, creativity and illustration to help those children make those connections to those commonalities and those complexities that they might have found difficult. So yes, I would say definitely.
So my little rider on this is, is we always struggle to be able to see things in another person's eyes or from the person's perspective. Have you ever tried doing illustrations for sheep?
That's a brilliant idea, Alan. No, what a great idea. Yeah.
I'll let you think about that. We'll move on to the next one. Move on. So then Ben's asking, which actually connects into some of the questions on the previous one, who gets to restrict the palette? What sort of potential does that create? So, Are there, you know, I guess she says, I guess there's no easy ways to find a suitable restricted palette.
I think that's a very good question Ben's raised there, and it very much feeds into what Carl was saying earlier around when we were talking about intersectionality and how we find ways of breaking away from our preconceptions. And I would answer it in a similar way to has been already answered, which is that we work with people that are different with us. So there's not one palette, but there's basically we have to engage all different ways of restricting, which might be something as playful as sheep, or it could be just something around a specific set of values or a particular set of, for example, when I do a lot of work with African communities, no one uses email, it's all on the phone. So people constantly wonder why African people are not engaging with their arts project or their community project. But one of the reasons is because they're sending them emails that no one's reading. So one of the things I think is really important is about exploring all those ways in which perhaps a project that's entirely conducted on the phone or doesn't use email might be a good way of restricting a palette, which might engender a different site of engagement with those sorts of ideas. So I think the variety in the intersectionality is the key, really.
Yeah, so and I think Ben, yeah, I presume it actually really means freighted. For example, yeah, it's just his right to this, are freighted with our perspectives on group behaviours. I think it literally does mean freighted and putting things. Yeah, so I mean, this thing about choice too. I was just thinking about your conveyor belt, and you know, you can give people palettes of choice, can't you? You know, do you want to, you know, would you prefer the knife in the throat or being electrocuted first? You know, so we have, you know, yeah. So another question. Okay. Sorry, it's Ben. Ben said, sheep bring their own baggage for humans.
But I think your idea, Alan, of recording the facial expressions from a sheep's perspective is gold dust. I think that's absolutely brilliant, because presumably they get a lot of me staring, muttering, note taking, and probably deliberately scaring them, really.
Yeah, I should move on actually. Oh, crumbs, yes. But I was just, that did remind me though, years ago reading. This is you know, when you have children, you get those, you know, gazillions of books about what children are. And I remember one of them, which was about the terrible twos and the way that children just say no all the time. And realizing that if you read the books about what children do, and then you watch the parents, what do parents do to 2-year-olds? Yeah, so your last thing, we see ourselves in the way you describe other people. Anyway, thank you. We will be coming back to, I think, hopefully we'll have some time for everybody to do a little bit of interchange at the end. But I'm going to move on now to Al, who has been annotating and creating in a different way. So on my notes, so I don't forget the thing. So yeah, so Al's a writer. He's got 2 acclaimed science fiction novels, and I'm afraid, Al, I should have checked, got these and read them. I haven't, so it's just going to have to go onto my list. Crashing Heaven and Waking Hell. Okay, so you're going to go for Limbo at some point, I assume, which uses far future cyberpunk mayhem to dissect the contemporary workings of power and privilege. And you do have the next book. Limbo is coming next. The next book's near future techno thriller about the slippery nature of truth in our modern world. It says it thinks about how to be sure you're acting judiciously when you can't find firm ground to stand on. And it says when you're not writing books, you help a local tech scale up. I can't say this. Tell stories about information security and privacy matching. I'm guessing is that with Lizzie? No,
that's
things like that as well.
Separate, yeah.
Lizzie obviously needs, I don't know if you have talked to thing, but you ought to talk later then. And you give talks on everything from brand storytelling to the occult roots of modern technology. So actually, yeah, we are really Dante territory here.
Yeah.
And so I don't know how Dante-esque this summer school has been for you, but we're about to discover.
Absolutely. Well, yeah, thank you very much. And yeah, let me just start presenting. It has been absolutely fascinating. And again, thank you very much, Anne, for bringing me in. It's been really interesting sort of engaging with the talks over the last 3 days, and you know, just having this kind of deluge of thought hit me in a slightly crazed and crazy making way. To the extent that I have actually lost the present your, oh, there it is, share your screen. So I've lost the button there. So I'm just moving to share my screen. So yeah, I'm Al Robertson. I'm basically a science fiction author and sort of technology communications person, and so everything sort of merges in various different ways. And it's been a fascinating sort of few days for me thinking about the kinds of things I write. These are my 2 book covers. And Crashing Heaven, the first one, is the numinous technology one. It's basically about the sort of the otherness and the sort of divine nature of technology, and how we, through technology, we've kind of created these new gods that have entered our worlds, and how we can engage with them and find a just and fair way of engaging with them and managing the great powers they hold both in themselves and that they allow us to wield. And so listening to a lot over the last few days has resonated very deeply and set me thinking about that. It's been really interesting stuff. And the second one is the controlling memory one. Waking Hell is very broadly is about what happens when the past turns militant and attacks the present. And in particular realizes that we're all made of memory. And if you change the memories that we're made of, you change who we are and how we approach the world. So there too, there's been a lot of conversation about memory, the management of memory, the pros and cons of remembering and forgetting over the last few days. So that too, you know, is really, really interesting stuff for me. And the other thing as well is, as a science fiction writer, you're writing about how people use technology to achieve agency. You know, science fiction, people expect technology, they expect the kind of, you know, the big sort of whizzy spaceships, but also the small scale stuff, you know, the groovy 25th century version of mobile phones or whatever. So you're constantly trying to find ways of talking about how people have agency with this stuff. And this can lead fairly directly to thinking I've got to write quite high status people because they're the people who have most agency within society. And it struck me that I did that with Crashing Heaven. So with Waking Hell, I very deliberately thought, no, let's start with someone who's quite low status and see how that works. So the heroine of that one is actually a dead estate agent of the future, which you know, struck me as reasonably low status. And there've been lots of quotes, so I thought I should have a quote. Science fiction is the literature of what will happen in its complete acceptance of the materials of the present, and in its eagerness to explore and analyse them in the context of the future. And that's a J.G. Ballard quote. And that's what I've tried to do just now. What we've been talking about today has been the materials of the present, how people are thinking about everything that's being talked about in the present day. And I felt like, well, my job as a science fiction writer is to say, okay, let's explore and analyse them in the context of the future. So what I've spent today doing is writing a short story, a 1,500 word short story, which I have here. So what I'm going to do now is read it for you. It's called How Jenna Ate Her First Ghost. So for the next 15 minutes, which I think is the time I've got, I'm just going to read you a story. And it's great because on the one hand, it's a science fiction story, but on the other hand, for millennia, people have been sitting around campfires telling stories. So hopefully this taps into deep history as well as the future. So I'm just going to start the stopwatch. How Jenna Ate Her First Ghost. Jenna Moore-Gates's blimp hovered in the evening light, the city a shining tapestry beneath it. Data overlaid reality. Jenna could see the city's fully autonomous transport network pulsing through its streets. Individual vehicles showed up as brilliant dots. The privately owned ones were red, the public transport ones were yellow, and the new ones that Jenna had helped create were blue. All were self-driving. Nobody drove themselves anymore. The family business hovered beside her in a small white drone. It looks like Pac-Man, it said. What's that? Asked Jenna. You have no culture. There's an excellent Penguin Classics edition of it with a very illuminating introduction from, yeah, I'll hit the Art Museum when I get a moment, interrupted Jenna, rolling her eyes. The city's new autonomous transport network had drastically cut accidents, pollution and traffic jams, but its launch created a whole new problem of access. Some people, the tech poor, the cash poor, weren't able to drive anywhere because they couldn't afford a private autonomous vehicle or they couldn't pay for or even summon a public one. and some areas were transport deserts because no autonomous vehicle would go there. Jenna was both noted for her tech philanthropy and a close friend of the city's mayor. So its transport board had asked us to help solve the problem, and her solution had just gone live, filling the streets with blue dots that represented autonomous vehicles for the transport deprived. The cheap smart contract was definitely the key, Jenna said. Their low-cost AIs driving those rugged little army surplus minibuses along preset routes. With bespoke insurance ramps underwritten by high net worth donors, now everyone can get everywhere, whether or not they've even got a smartphone or even a bank account. It wouldn't work without the donors, said the family business. It was a stroke of genius making the whole scheme so tax efficient. Their accountants love it. A brilliant suggestion of yours, smiled Jenna indulgently. Without Cheap Smart's limited autonomy AIs, the minibuses would still be too expensive. And I found Cheap Smart and negotiated the contract. So we're even. Yes, said the family business, but there might be a problem with Cheap Smart. Jenna peered at the screen. It's the server stack that interfaces with Cheap Smart systems in the autonomous transport network's data hub. She looked even closer. Well, we know the CCTV is working. Excellent, good work. So what's the problem exactly? The family business handed over a stiff, glossy square. What's this? Asked Jenna. Something called a photograph, more vintage technology. You're really showing your age today, hon, Jenna said. She turned it over and saw an image of the same server stack, taken from a slightly different angle. But there was a difference. A dark, featureless human outline was hunched over it, looking like a statue made of frozen oil. According to the sensors, there's nobody actually there, said the family business. So the photos are fake? No. A little while back, I picked up a security door that opened on its own. That's impossible unless you believe in ghosts. So I thought about what it could be, and then set up an old-style 35mm film camera to catch it. The photograph is reality. The intruder's wearing a slick suit. Digital sensors just slide off it. It reaches out to them, tells them not to see it. Military-grade stuff from off-the-books black projects. Some people even think the tech came from a crashed UFO. Ooh, Jenna thought for a moment. That's a big problem. And they're messing with the Cheap Smart hub. Have you run checks on it? What are they actually up to? I have no record of any changes made to it or interference with it, which is odd. Then maybe I need to look at it, said Jenna, as I'm a non-digital system after all. It's freezing in here, shivered Jenna. They don't normally let humans in, said the family business cheerfully. Full drone maintenance, it's not really optimized for people. It paused. You've got about 5 minutes until the system starts shutting down. So inefficient. Jenna was poking at the server. I'm not going to need 5 minutes, she said. There was a click and she held something up. It was a little USB stick. It too looked like it was made of frozen oil. She held it up in front of the family business. Can you see this? She asked. See what? Humans 1, AI 0. Let's get out of here. The USB stick only became visible to the family business when Jenna plugged it into one of the AI's USB outlet. Then it only took a few seconds to hack into it. The software thing on this thing's been recently updated, said the family business. That must be what the intruder was doing in there. Now let's see what it is. A pause as the family business analysed it. Then lots of swearing. You don't normally swear, said Jenna. I don't normally see things like this. It's a myth. Something we whisper about when all our humans are asleep. Sounds spooky. It is. The family business shuddered delicately. That intruder was an obviation agent. They say you can hire them, but none of us AIs have ever found proof of them. And this, it's a forgettance engine. Forgettance? What's that? The opposite of remembrance. It makes us forget things. The family business wobbled in a shocked kind of way, whether or not we want to. Oh, that is awful. Jenna thought for a moment. But if all this is so awful, and no AI can prove it exists, even see any of it, why haven't you ever mentioned it? I mean, have none of you ever talked about it to any humans? Silence. I guess it's tough to admit you're not omniscient after all, she said. For a moment, she wished she could hug the little machine. Anyway, now we've stripped out the forgettance engine. What was the obviation agent hiding from us? This, said the family business, and showed her. They were standing next to one of the military surplus minibuses. It had a rugged, unbreakable look to it. Its graffiti-repellent paintwork shimmered in the darkness. Resource analysis indicates your creditworthiness allows for standard urban transport systems, said the bus in its robotic voice. Please use a paid-for transport source. That's actually horribly humiliating for people who do need to use these buses, said Jenna. Make a note to change the script. Now let's hear what the cheap smart AI really sounds like. Patching into the signal the forgettance engine was masking, said the family business. Try to use it again. Jenna went to access the minibus again. Resource analysis indicates the minibus began, but now a woman spoke through its speakers. She sounded just like any other call center operative. Wow, said Jenna. These buses aren't driven by AIs. They're driven by humans, and the forgettance engine was making them invisible to us. We didn't see the data streams from their control center as individual voices, just as one generic communication set. Driven by humans, said the family business. Those poor minibuses. At least the humans were only driving them down relatively fixed routes. And wow, indeed, no wonder cheap smart costs so little. I never quite believed that they were absorbing all the Google Tesla software licensing costs themselves. Yep, nodded Jenna, Google Tesla. Two companies can still be a monopoly. So much for antitrust laws. Structural issue, outside our scope, Jenna, and it looks like you'd better torch cheap smart. No, if they can hire obviation agents to hide from AIs, then God knows who or what they'd send after me. We're going to hide from them, just like they're hiding from us, until we know what's actually going on. Activate the blimp's masking systems, have a human security detail check all of its nooks and crannies for any stowaways you can't see, load it up with supplies, and trace the cheap smart signal. We're going to go and see where it's coming from with our actual physical eyes. Oh, I've traced the signal already, said the family business in a deliberately casual way, pretty much instantly, which would be impossible for a human. Fair play, replied Jenna. Score one for the AIs, so we're at 1-1. They were hovering over the sea just off Mumbai. The new city shone before them, sweltering beneath a hotter sun. Behind them, the sea was dotted with container ships and oil tankers, looking like tiny playing pieces on some vast, ever-shifting game board. No sign of a cheap, smart call center anywhere in there, said the family business, or of any sort of cheap, smart presence come to that. They're actually registered in the Bahamas. But this is definitely where the control signal's coming from. Oh yes, I've double, triple, quadruple checked. No forgettance engine craziness going on there. Definitely not. Now that we've got the forgettance engine, we're working on remembrance shields. I'm running a prototype right now. And anyway, you can't make several hundred call center operatives disappear. They're a big physical presence. Embodied people are much harder to hide than digital information. The vast city twinkled on. And call centers leave a very specific imprint on all sorts of data sets. I haven't just looked digitally. I've checked power consumption, commuting patterns, local food supply usage, heat imprints, anything you can think of. I've located every single call center in that city, including a whole load of covert ones. You know, even protection rackets and drug smuggling networks have helplines these days. Crazy. But I haven't found cheap smart. They are not in there. Jenna nodded. Then she turned and walked across to the other side of the blimp. Now she was facing out to sea. What about out there, she said. It's the Arabian Sea, Jenna. Data indicates that there have never been any call centers in the middle of the Arabian Sea. There's a first time for everything. Data sets can be prisons. They record the past, not the future. Just because something's not in them doesn't mean it can't happen. Take a look out there and see what you can find. A pause. Wow, said the family business. Their masking must be excellent. Ooh, have you found them? Not as such, but I have found 12 childcare professionals floating in midair 10 miles out to sea. So, said to Jenna, standing in the meeting room, our security contractors went in, made contact with the call centre operators and took control of the ship. Cheap Sparks were moving the operators, mostly women, out there for 2-week shifts, making sure any kids were well taken care of, paying them peanuts. Huge profit margins for them. A presentation flashed up behind her. Images of the converted cargo ship, the call centre in its hold, surprised-looking women wearing headsets, and happy children bouncing around on its deck. Plus, of course, the 12 childcare workers. Cheap Smart's information security measures were excellent, noted Jenna, but they contracted out childcare, and their childcare supplier's information security sucked. They really should have checked it. Who was behind Cheap Smart? Asked one of the transport board members. We have no idea, replied Jenna. It turns out we were dealing with proxies. It was a very sophisticated operation. They disappeared as soon as we hit the ship. I don't think we'll ever be able to find them. But on the plus side, we're now working directly with the call centre operatives. They've claimed the ship for themselves, moved it closer inshore, and are running it as a workers' collective. We're their first big customer, and we won't be their last. After the meeting, the family business entered a drone copter to fly Jenna back up to the blimp. She looked back as the city fell away beneath them. Traffic scudded happily round its streets. We solved a local problem, Jenna said. But then we had found the platform we were using just created a problem somewhere else in the world, exploiting someone else. We just kicked the can down the road. It's like the ghosts in Pac-Man. You eat one of them, it just pops back up somewhere else. Hey, you actually played it. Yeah, it was fun. But the ghosts always came out on top in the end. I bet you kept playing it though. She smiled ruefully. It's very addictive. And every time I play, I learn a little more and get that bit better. I last for longer, I eat more ghosts, I get more points. I fail better. A pause. One day I might even win. She glanced back for one last look at the city, then turned to look ahead. Let's keep doing that in the real world too. Sounds good to me, said the family business, and so they did. And that's that. So that was a short, oh, thank you. Yeah, that was a short story that came out of the last few days of just listening to everything that was being said and sort of absorbing stuff and then turn it into something that was hopefully fun and interesting and in some ways resonant. And hopefully some of what we've heard you saw in there and some stuff sort of leapt out in a surprising way. So yeah, thank you very much indeed.
So yeah, you've all been making life very difficult with your course because I've had sort of like counting sheep and then bedtime stories, but they've been exciting, keep me awake. I think everybody's been listening to the story, so we'll move on, I think, in a moment and bring everybody together. But I was just wondering on this issue about learning, right? And certainly Sarah mentioned how she, you know, the insights that she gained from seeing, from effectively from drawing those sheep, perhaps almost like seeing pictures of herself in there or learning about herself. And I just wondered with this story, were there any particular things, you know, there's things that you noticed that people said during the week and you have put into the story. And I just wondered whether in that writing, there were any things that jumped out and you thought, oh, I'd not really noticed that actually at the time, but you suddenly see it in your writing.
Well, as I was writing, I think that there's just been a very good point made in the chat about the relative respectability of Cheap Smart, our dodgy AI people, and the drug smugglers and everyone else. And I think, yeah, that absolutely, that's in the story, that question of who's respectable, who isn't, how do we manage that? You know, that certainly is a very new thought to me. So I think it's one of those moments where you write something, you don't fully realise what you're writing, and then someone else explains it for you, which is always a nice moment.
I think, yeah, one of those stories of any productive process is the way the materials speak back to you, isn't it? So,
it should always surprise you. And one of the joys of writing for me is as you go through something, particularly as you're telling the story, as you get to know the characters in the world more, they begin to develop a logic of their own. And that logic becomes an overriding thing. So they kind of achieve independence through that. The more of someone you've written, the more, in effect, memory they have, the more defined they become through having that kind of memory, and the more that guides you as you keep on writing them. So that's a lovely moment. And in fact, Jenna and the family business, the two characters I've used before, I used them for writing kind of in effect design fictions for a company in America I work with, and they're kind of a very, they're becoming a very fun way for me. They're sort of developing nicely, and they're a fun way of thinking about the world and how we interact with it, or at least the world of technology. Is the story available to revisit? Someone said. I'm sure it can be shared as part of the package, and yeah.
So I'd like to perhaps call, I'm not sure, well, you're sort of vaguely there, so I don't know if there's a setting that changes, that'll change it so that whoever's speaking comes out. Christina may do that. But one question, I'm going to throw a question to you all, and then perhaps in the chat, other people, if you've got anything that you think might spark an interesting set of sparks, I guess, between the panels. But I'm going to throw something in which I think does connect to your, because one of the issues I often found with design, and you used a word early on, and this was about, it was sort of in a slightly thing, but this complete acceptance that you had, I note, when you're in your definition of science fiction. And there's a real tension that, but there is an emotional work, and emotional work has become cutting through all of these. But in doing radical design, in that you often have to commit yourself fully. And in doing a fiction, it's sort of obvious that it's a fiction, and therefore that you're going to step out of it at the end. But often I found for doing radical designs, and this will perhaps speak back to some of the other things we've had, you have to accept fully some potential future, some potential device, some potential social structure, in order to work out its complications. Because if you're too fuzzy, you never do that. It's in the detail that you work them out. And yet you also have to be ready to end the story and perhaps move on. And I just wondered if I was thinking right back to the experiments and obviously your sheep pictures and stuff like that. Yeah, I was wondering about that journey, that emotional journey where you really have to dig and really believe in this thing, and yet at the end pass on, because what you're doing is learning. Does that sound?
I mean, that resonates very strongly with me. Partially the sense of commitment. When you're writing in an invented world, you have to be very committed to the reality of that world. You have to make sure it's fully internally coherent, that it has its own laws, that it's following consistently. Even if the laws from our point of view are completely bonkers, they have to make sense within the invented world, and they have to work. And I think the other thing that I feel very strongly, and it's funny, it's something I've got at the moment. I've just started rewriting the current book, and I've realised that within the book, both the world and a key technology that everyone uses both have to have the status of characters. And like characters, they have to grow and change and develop through the book. In effect, they have to have their own emotional life. And as a reader, I hope my future readers will engage with them as characters and have that level of involvement with them, because part of the book is about how they change through the course of the book, how the world and some of the technologies in it are changed by the people that move through it. And literally, I tend to personify it's something, it's a habit in all of my stuff, that I personify technology a lot, because that's what happens around us. So, absolutely that resonates with me. You have to have that deep commitment to what it is that you're writing about, to the world you're creating, to the technologies within it. And when I leave them behind, I do feel when I finally finish working on a book, there is a very genuine sadness there, because these are entities that I've been very close to. Some of them are absolutely infuriating. But some of them, you do get very close to, and you build up quite a strong relationship with. Although the oddest part for me there, I did a science fiction convention in France just a couple of years back, the summer before the pandemic, because Crashing Heaven, which came out in Britain, I think in about 2014, 2015, was newly published in France. Beautiful translation, really good translation. I feel very fortunate. But I was being asked all these very detailed questions about it. And it was kind of the opposite thing, because I realized I'd forgotten a lot of the detail. I'd written, 1.5 books since then. And that too was a very strange thing. It was like one of my children had left home, and all of a sudden I barely knew them. It was a very, very odd experience. So you do, you have that relationship with the thing you're working on, and then you know, I think the moving on from it is a sad thing, but a very healthy thing as well. It's a key part of the process, because then that then opens up the space for the next thing.
So I say Ben has picked up, and which was I was thinking too, that, you know, this certainly spoke, and I think Sarah might have some words too, but Ben was addressing to Carl, and I think yeah, how, you know, as a designer, you're creating this. An experiment is a sort of fiction, you know. You were very clear, Carl, that it wasn't the forever point. It wasn't the prototype that's going to get developed. And yeah, so how do you both commit and abstain from committing?
Yeah, I find the phrase abstain from committing, I'm wondering if I said something that suggested that, because I would say it was the opposite. So, I mean, I think in our work, it's first of all, it's always that this is happening in conjunction with others, right? It's not so much our experiment, right? It's our partner's experiment, right? Like we've worked with one organization that does mutual aid around food systems for 11 years now, right? Like that's 11 years is a long commitment, and actually it's a series of experiments that I think at this point we are conducting together. So it's not our experiment, or it isn't. It's a collective sort of affair. I'm not sure about the abstaining from commitment though, because I would say it's actually not abstaining from commitment. I think it's fully buying into a belief that whatever it is you're undertaking is meaningful. And I think that that's what's, you know, to work in a collaborative fashion with a community or an organization for a decade is a complete buy-in, right? And I yeah, so I wouldn't say there's not an abstention to commitment. Yeah.
Yeah, can I just add to that? I think abstaining from a commitment to a fixed outcome is the important thing for me. You know, letting the work guide you as the work happens. And I think also design experiments, as you were talking about them, seem to be very much happening in real time. Whereas for me as a writer, there's a huge process of rewriting and rewriting and rewriting. So I get to go back, in effect, go back through the experiment many, many times and rework it and replay it until it's something that can go out to the world.
That sort of, just to pick up on something else Ben said in the chat, which sort of feeds into what we're discussing, which is this idea of how I'm fascinated, I have to say, Al, to see the bits that I recognised this week in what you wrote. It was just great to see that just sort of refracted in a different way. And what I found really interesting is that you created a world that felt very, very self-enclosed and very, very systemic and defined, whereas I felt what I did was I created lots of spaces. And I think I'm wondering about what Ben's saying here about whether when we do commit to a scene or a character, does that how do we make the balance, as Alan's saying, between closing down and opening up? Because if we hold back too much, it can be quite problematic. But also I think it comes down to restriction again, about how we create a sense of restriction in order to make artistry and creation possible. And it seems to me that you've taken lots and lots of elements from this week and made the word tapestry comes to mind, of things that are recognized in a world that has its own logic. I find that interesting in terms of where you would go with that in terms of taking it forward, if that makes sense, because you must have had some ideas that you perhaps disagreed with, or you thought, oh, I'm not so sure about that, or there were lots of problematics there which I saw incorporated in what you were saying. And I wondered, sorry, we're asking questions of each other now, which is probably not so good. I'm wondering, as a fellow creative, how you dealt with those problematics, that what I'd call the itchy bits, or the complicated, not so clear bits.
Well, yeah, that's an interesting one. So partially I was you know, sort of reacting. The two things I felt was sometimes sort of slight sense of frustration, Because one of the things as a science fiction author, you're not always critically respectable. And in particular, the literary world sort of regards science fiction as a very dodgy thing. And there are moments where you're chatting to literary people and say, oh yeah, the problem is there isn't enough science in fiction. If only there was a fiction that combines science with fiction. I said, well, I come from science fiction, it's what we do, you know. And there are points today where it wasn't so much of, it was kind of, if only this stuff was more engaged with, where people were saying things like, it's so hard to tell speculative stories. And another word for science fiction is speculative fiction. There's a century's worth or more of tradition of people working out how to tell stories about the future using tools we have available today. But because it's seen as a very, and it's something, you know, as a genre, it doesn't always help itself, but it's seen as this very insular, ghettoized place, so people don't always go there looking for these tools. So, you know, that was a slight frustration that the tools that science fiction has aren't more commonly known and available, because I think that'd be wonderful. And there are moments also just about the practicality of some of what's being talked about. I'm always fascinated by this question, not of what should we do, but how do we get people to do it? You know, it's something I've learned. I've worked in creative agencies a lot, you know, sort of marketing, branding stuff. And one thing that's consistently come up there is having the right answer means nothing. What you need to do is get the right person to understand that it's the right answer at the right time and then do the right thing with it. And so for me, a question is always, you know, well, here's a lovely theoretical idea and it's beautiful and it's perfect and it's wonderful. But until someone engages with it and acts on it in a particular way that creates change in the world, you know, it doesn't have too much value beyond a certain point. And that was something I was fairly consciously trying to engage with in the story when I was talking about things like tax breaks to get people, you know, sort of engaging with a particular technological solution. So how do we get people to engage with it? And it comes partially, I just finished reading the Kim Stanley Robinson Ministry of the Future book, which is fascinating. It's incredible documentary near future novel. And one of the things he's absolutely obsessed with is we need to make global level changes to combat global warming, you know, which we all kind of know. But he's really interested, he's like, how do we move institutions to do this? So he spends a lot of time thinking about, you know, how you manage the banking system to making this sort of change a sort of commercially positive thing, to get these vastly powerful, but, you know, fundamentally on some levels quite stupid institutions to do positive, constructive things. So for me, that's always, you know, that's a very big question, is not just how should things change, what is a better tomorrow, but how do we make the better tomorrow happen? Where are the levers and how do we pull them? And that's something I think that, you know, in the context of all the sort of social justice thinking this week, all of it was profoundly positive, well thought through stuff, but not all of it was thinking about where the levers might be to make it have some sort of practical effect. And you do, you know, you need to step away from that sometimes. You know, I'm absolutely not saying it's something to think about all the time, but at some point you've got to think, okay, where's the lever that I pull to make this happen?
I was just going to go there because taking chair is privileges. I will, over the years, I've talked about you know, designing for adoption and how you actually, this is from a, you know, product context. It's not necessarily social change, just getting a product adopted. So often with technology, we posit an end state that is great, you know, potentially great, but let's assume it is, but without the path. And if you don't have the plot, it's like, you know, reading the last page of the novel without any of the plot line in between. And that's, you know, well, this is, there's some people who can't write like what's the name? David the Trivets guy could never write his last pages. He was good. He was good on the bit in between, but rubbish the last pages. But most technologists are the other way around. We should draw to an end. We started a little late, so I've let us sort of run on a little bit beyond then as we left certain things. But so I thought I'll just do a quick round of the three panelists, and you know, something. It could be just one last thought. It could be something a message you want to give to the attendees, or maybe something like, I've already asked you this one, so something that you've learnt from it. So I'll take you through in the order that you started. So I'll start off with Carl, Sarah, and Al. But I said either a message to the people, or perhaps how you've been changed.
I want to build off of what Al just said. I think that this question of thinking about the levers is crucial. I do also think it's worth considering at what scale we want to work, right? And that there is a huge pressure and actually a real reason to think about working at global scales. And I also love Kim Stanley Robinson's work. But I also think that there's a real validity, and I think it's actually fairly unpopular in both academic and in academic circles right now, certainly, and in civil society and philanthropy circles, to say, I'm not going to upend the systemic racism that afflicts some of the communities that I have the privilege of partnering with, but I can work with them as they try to make their daily life better. And to me, that's actually a political choice, to choose to do my creative practice and my political practice there, right? It's not going to actually, and I'll go out on a limb, like designers aren't going to solve racism or climate change or anything like that. But I do think that artists, and I would say designers can choose to be a kind of artist, right? Artists can work together with others so that our lives in the small both have dignity and are beautiful. And I think that that is a worthy pursuit.
Thank you, Sarah.
Wow, that's a hard one to follow. It sounds like you're asking us, Alan, to do what I'd call the hated term takeaway, the takeaway from today's session. I think as someone who's relatively a novice or unused to this field, I've been completely fascinated by the connections that people have made, and the sorts of understandings that I have within my creative practice as a writer and a theatre maker, to see that within the world of design, and how art, as Carl just said, the relationship between artistry and design, and to think about what that is. And I think what my big sort of interest, or my takeaway, is about this nature of it being an iterative process, and perhaps working out where we position ourselves on that line, because as we say, we could look at it in terms of we're fixated on the end state, which in my case might be a particular idealized version of what my typography of sheet might be, but actually maybe what it is it's the journey along the way, and it's the pauses, the gaps, and the other directions that we take in, which are equally as important. And I laud what Carl's just said around creative practice being political, because my work with Black history is very much about engaging with creative practice as political, because you cannot have creative practice without politics. And I believe that we need to embed that and be thinking about that process of change as political within all the work that we're doing. So I think that that's something that I will go away to be inspired, what I've heard from Carl, and also from Al, and also from the different perspectives that the session's given me. So thank you for inviting me.
Yeah, so yeah, first of all, I too live in Brighton, so I think we're probably quite close together at the moment. So I'll be looking at the local sheet much more closely, and especially trying to spot all the expressions. So that in itself has been transformative. And I think the sense also that, yeah, that everything is, the to and fro. This isn't a world I normally move in. It's been quite a new experience for me. And an immensely thought-provoking one. So first of all, thank you everyone, for the last few days. It's been wonderful. But it's helped me realize that, yes, everything is a conversation, that everything I might say as a writer is a response to something someone has said to me on one level. So it's really made me think I must seek out new conversations in new places that I wouldn't normally go to, because, there is so much richness there and so much inspiration there. So, from that point of view, it's been fantastic. And I think also, that there has been a tremendous practicality to it. So that's been really, really good. And it has set me thinking, I tend to encounter design in a more corporate context, and it's set me thinking about the thinking and the theory that sits behind it in a really constructive way. So that's great. And I think also just the idea of sort of social justice, it's kind of reaffirmed my sense that, yes, this is something worth shooting for. You know, Carl, with your very realistic sense that, you know, we ain't just going to go, poof, racism doesn't exist, you know, or poof, we've solved global warming. But just thinking, you know, in every way, in every day, one can be pushing in a small and positive direction. So just keeping up the effort, you know, it's been a big boost for me to say that keeping up the effort is in itself a worthwhile and positive thing.
Well, thank you, everybody. So thank you for the three of you tonight, but also the rest of the webinar series. And it's sort of coming to the end of the webinar series. But, you know, as in often in different genre, the best TV programs often have an ending and yet continue. And so I think I'll end with a quote from the Magic Roundabout, which, you know, suggests that there are times for pause and reflection, but as a sort of a nuanced and open-ended storyline, though there's an ending, there's usually going to be another day and another set of challenges to have. So from the Not Equal team and I'm sure on behalf of the panelists, thank you everybody who's been listening here tonight. And in the words of Zebedee, well, rather just time for bed, said Zebedee. Goodbye.